Well, welcome to the third of our online sessions for the Point 2022. Thank you again for joining us and staying on board as we go through. I'd like to thank PayEd, sponsor for the session, and also like to thank all of our sponsors for the Point 2022 for making it possible. Thank you so much for your support. And before we get started, Brett will be taking some questions at the end of his presentation. So shoot them through to the platform, and we'll make sure that they get asked as we go. Now, Brett was speaking yesterday, so I won't keep the introduction too long so he can get into his insights. But Brett's international bestseller and world-renowned futurist and media personality. Brett, believe it or not, is currently #1 in 2 separate categories of podcasts, which is incredibly impressive when you look at the number of downloads that go on to that. He's also spoken at 50 countries and appeared on many US TV programs, and also was advisor to the Obama administration on fintech. So Brett today is going to talk about the future and essentially everything, and give us some great insights in terms of what is happening around the world of payments and what we should be expecting into the future as well. So Brett, welcome to the session today, and look forward to hearing what you've got to tell us.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah,
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Yeah, it's good.
Well, referring to Dave's session, I can confirm I'm not a dog pretending to be a toaster, but I may be a 400-pound teenager called Cheryl sitting in his mother's basement. I'll leave that up to your judgment. No, just joking. I want to get into sort of a broad range of topics this morning from a macro perspective, and then drill down into the payment space at a little bit more detail for you. But the macro perspective will give you some understanding of the impetus behind some of the changes we're dealing with, not just in the payment space, but more broadly, I guess, philosophically, in terms of the way humanity is going to have to adapt to some of the big changes that we're looking at. It's very interesting to be having this conversation just after we've had the US midterms. You know, I spend about half of my time in the US, and of course, you know, the politics there are just insane. But you know, the challenges society is facing from a policy perspective are becoming very clear when we look at things like the elections around the world, the rise of the populist movement, you know, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the US, and so forth. But if you look at the core elements of, I guess, uncertainty, economic uncertainty in particular, that are emerging globally, these are the 4 drivers that we identified in our book, The Rise of Technosocialism. And I want to frame our discussion helping sort of give some background to this. So if you think about inflation that's happening right now, this has created a huge amount of uncertainty. The prices of basic goods have gone up, the price of fuel, etc., and food. And of course, we had the Economist view of this yesterday from David Mann, a really interesting conversation on that. But if you look at this trend, this is not just about the pandemic. This economic uncertainty has been happening actually for 20, 30, 40 years. If you look just at wage growth in countries like the United States and the UK, wage growth has basically been stagnant over the last 40 years or so. Now, in many respects, this is because of deregulation of financial markets. It's also the attack on trade unions that we saw in the Reagan and the Thatcher era governments. This sort of froze growth of wages, and now it means that, you know, purchasing power of wages in countries like the US and the UK, and to some extent Australia and New Zealand, are much lower than what they were back in, say, the 1970s or the 1960s. Buying a home, you know, cost you a lot less money in respect to your annual salary. You know, in the 60s in New Zealand and Australia, you could buy an average family home for 3 or 4 times the average annual salary. Today, if you're in Sydney, it's 19 times your salary. In Hong Kong, it's 26 times. And that means that we have a whole generation of kids growing up that may never be able to afford to buy their own home. This is a some would argue, a design element of capitalism in some respect, but is a sign of growing inequality, which is one of the four core economic drivers of uncertainty. We also have, of course, the emergence of artificial intelligence, which is going to change the way we work dramatically. And, of course, climate change cannot be understated in terms of the effect it's going to have on our worldview and philosophy as a species. To understand how this uncertainty expresses itself, one of the really interesting measures is looking at protests around the world. So the protests that we've seen globally in the first 20 years of the 21st century, the first 2 decades, have basically been double in terms of the frequency or number of protests globally that we saw in the average of the 20th century, particularly the last 50 years or so of the 20th century. But the participation in those protests has increased 1,000%. So people are clearly dissatisfied with the system and are looking for solutions to that. But emerging over the next 20 or 30 years with the influx of artificial intelligence into our economies, into our manufacturing, into our supply chain, into our daily life, the outcome of this by the 2040s, certainly by the 2050s, is the emergence of what we call smart economies, highly autonomous, highly automated economies. And this is going to start obviously in the Western, developed countries, but also because of the greenfield nature of developing nations. We're going to see, things like renewable energies and elements like that perhaps take hold even faster in those economies, creating significant economic growth in those regions. Now, while there's going to be economic growth at a market level, the influx of artificial intelligence and high levels of automation in society really creates some challenges in terms of things like employment, which we're going to get into in a moment. The question I asked David Mann about China was sort of an indication, sort of me trying to get some validation of the thesis that we put in our book Technosocialism, but is generally accepted by economists around the world that China is going to become the world's largest economy sometime in the 2030s. In many respects, it already is. More wealth is held in China privately than in the United States, for example. And China has been making huge strides recently in respect to the elements of research and development and creativity and innovation in their economy. This is not just the Belt and Road, but in respect to sort of core elements. So last year, China issued more patents than the United States. If you're a fan of blockchain, 84% of the patents globally on blockchain are Chinese patents. So China has been really developing its skill sets here. A great book for you to read if you want to learn a little bit more about the Chinese ecosystem in terms of innovation is a book by Kai-Fu Lee. He was the head of Google in China. He now runs his own consultancy. But Kai-Fu Lee wrote a book called The AI Superpowers. And definitely you should check it out if you're interested in that. But the perception that we've had in the West that China sort of copies everything from the West is really no longer accurate. It hasn't been the case for about a decade. In many areas, such as neuromorphic chip development, 5G, edge computing development, the use of blockchain in payments and banking and so forth, China is significantly ahead of the United States. When it comes to payments, China is definitely ahead of most of the rest of the developed world in respect to this. And that's not just in respect to mobile payments, for example, or bank-to-bank payments, but also in respect to their development of their central bank digital currency. Now the details here are a little bit behind in terms of the stats. China in October crossed $100 billion. The CBDC is now available in 15 provinces, so that's about 40 cities in China, and there's almost 6 million merchants on the CBDC program in China already. China obviously has been developing their CBDC program since 2014. The US Federal Reserve is now talking about trials of a CBDC potentially in the future, and so that shows you already how far ahead China is in respect to central bank digital currencies compared with the United States. And why this is important is we do need programmable money, whether it's a CBDC or stable coins or some sort of form, to make this transition to this smart economy or highly autonomous economy platforms. Now, what's interesting with the CBDC is not only that we have $100 billion, it's already been processed across the CBDC network in China, but also the fact that it has potential, particularly from a wholesale CBDC perspective, to be really transformative from a trade perspective. And that is, once we marry the CBDC with China's Belt and Road Initiative, then all bets are off in respect to the dominance of the US dollar currency. China's obviously a major trading country in the world, and if they were to enforce that wholesale trade on the Belt and Road needed to be done through a CBDC-based wallet, then this makes things very interesting. Over the course, the US may try and apply sanctions against China. They may try and do blockades of the China Belt and Road. But China has already invested $8 trillion in the Belt and Road infrastructure. And so that investment is pretty significant in terms of future trade and gives them a real advantage, which is why we think China is going to use their CBDC to try and de-dollarize the world in respect to trade, or at least at a minimum reduce the influence of US dollars. Now, why this is important from a payments NZ perspective is this really reinforces both the use of smart contracts and the use of wallets and the use of artificial intelligence from a payment gateway perspective and so forth in respect to operational cross-border trading and currency operation. And this takes us in a fairly different direction from the systems we have today, including potentially creating very different market mechanisms and so forth. So when you think of these autonomous economies that are emerging, you now see why China has a significant advantage when we start talking about things like supply chain automation and other elements of these smart economies, because they are creating these building blocks of autonomous supply chain and the ability to execute from a wholesale and a local economic perspective. And it's not just CBDC. Obviously, China and companies like Huawei have developed really the global standard in 5G technology. Ironically, I don't know if many of you know this, but the US doesn't use the global standard for 5G. They use a different frequency than the rest of the world, and they do that because the spectrum that is the standard for 5G around the world, which was essentially defined by China and Huawei through the development of their technologies, is owned by the US military, and that's going to be the case until I think 2026. And so the US has a different form of 5G technology there. Edge computing, the development of this sort of cloud-based technologies in China, the marriage of 5G into edge computing, the development of smart cities, neuromorphic chips, and so forth. China is already well ahead in many of these areas. If you check out what's been happening just in Shenzhen as a city, as an example, That's a really interesting example of smart city implementation, where you don't even, you know, if you're driving on the roads in Shenzhen, you'll never be pulled over for a speeding fine. They use image recognition, and you just receive a text message to your phone with the fine. Now, the first time you get a warning, second time you just automatically get a fine. And this has increased revenue significantly in this area, but reduced complexities that come from you know, traffic stops and so forth on motorways and highways and freeways. What's interesting about these smart economies of the 2040s and 2050s is we have to design them a little differently from the way we think about the world today. Some of the systems that we use become more centralized in nature, others become more distributed in nature. One of those is the energy grids. So as we move to a greener footprint in terms of electricity generation in particular, one of the things we're going to develop is localized storage and localized generation. So residential homes, for example, we are getting to the point very soon where it will be cheaper to put solar on residential homes in New Zealand and put batteries there for storage overnight than it will be just to pay for the transmission of electricity from the generators to the residential home through the network. We are approaching that point over the next couple of years. Already today in countries like the United States, it is cheaper today to deploy a 100 megawatt solar farm than it is to keep an existing coal plant running for 12 months. So with these changes, obviously spurred on not only by cheaper prices, but also by the need to create greener energy, we are going to have to rethink the design of our energy systems. So energy production is going to become more distributed. We are going to still need a national plan or national strategy in respect to how we deploy these things and start thinking about system design in this respect. But other systems are going to have to be more centralized, for example, healthcare. I was talking over dinner with some of our colleagues at the dinner last night about the mess that is the US healthcare system. The US pays more than twice the rest of the OECD nations in terms of healthcare. Their outcomes are often worse off, and 67% of all bankruptcies in the United States are healthcare related, which gives you an indication of the dysfunction of that system. But we believe that we could lower the cost of healthcare in the United States by about 70%, 70, through the use of various technologies over the next 20 years or so. The use of artificial intelligence for better diagnostics. 40% of diagnostics or diagnosis in the current healthcare system around the world are wrong. So that's why you always ask for a second opinion when you go to a doctor, because there's a 40% chance you've got incorrectly diagnosed. AI is going to address a lot of those problems. Genetic therapy, gene therapy. We've gone from gene sequencing to now using technologies like CRISPR and Talon and other things to now actually manipulate the gene. So if you have Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or cystic fibrosis or hereditary heart disease or hereditary breast cancer or something like this, in the future we'll be able to tweak your genes, those different proteins, to eliminate those diseases from your DNA, like editing out a bad software bug. 3D bioprinted organs, all of these sort of technologies coming together will produce a radical shift in terms of healthcare. But this requires massive data sets, and it requires the use of artificial intelligence on those data sets, which requires better centralization of the data. And this is obviously going to challenge markets like the United States, which are heavily privatized and rely on arbitrage and intermediaries to make money. That's even before we get into things like longevity. So that's interesting. But when we start talking about economies at an operational level, one of the things we're going to see in respect to automation is not only the use of artificial intelligence from a data perspective and in terms of trade and smart contracts and functioning of things like factories and so forth, but the use of robotics in that arena. So robots are going to make up or by the mid-2030s, robots are going to sort of match on the population of humans on the planet. So my only advice is to be kind to robots. You never know what's going to happen in the future. But I thought I'd show you this quick clip. It's a film called Mute. It's on Netflix if you want to see. It's a German sci-fi film with the actor Skarsgård. I can't remember his first name now. But it shows drones delivering food, working from these automated fast food production elements where you could order on your phone or order at the kiosk. And this drone comes in and drops the food on the table. He gets up from his little nap and there's the food on the table, and the drone lets itself out of the window. And so you might have also seen Ready Player One with them delivering pizzas, the Pizza Hut and things like that. We do expect drones to be a more frequent part of human life. Certainly by the end of this decade, we expect to be driving around in autonomous vehicles, which are essentially robots you sit in. And we are going to be seeing, autonomous transportation systems, whether that's huge ocean-going freight carriers or whether that is trucks delivering goods, from across the country. So this really represents a significant change to the way we think about the structure of economics. If you ever have studied economics, this is economics 101, right? Supply and demand curve, where the objective is to try and meet equilibrium. You put just as much human capital or labor into the system to account for the demand that you're seeing for various products or services that the market generates. And this is the way we've interpreted economic development at an economy level, and also the way we look at distribution of wealth. The primary mechanism we have for distribution of wealth in the economy today is giving someone a job and paying them for that job. And the assumption has always been, as demand goes up and as the economy grows, we create more jobs. But in a highly autonomous economy, we break the link between supply and demand and human capital. And so the graph would look something like this, where supply is a matter of processing cycles driven by, large-scale autonomy, and that the demand can curve a lot more aggressively because of that adaptability in the system based on autonomy. The only constraint on this system is allocation of resources rather than human capital. So this detachment of traditional supply and demand and economics from human labor or human capital means large-scale, highly autonomous economies are going to create also significant techno-unemployment. So when you hear Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Richard Branson, these entrepreneurs talking about the future of our economies, they often talk about universal basic income because they realize that we really have two choices. Either we create something like universal basic income as a social safety net for this high level of disruption by artificial intelligence, or we're going to face massive social unrest. That's really the binary options in respect to this. There is a third option. The third option is banning all technology like artificial intelligence to keep humans employed. But that sort of pauses the advancement of society and is not a long-term solution. Ultimately, we're going to have to deal with this. The other problems we're going to have to face, which is important for the development of artificial intelligence and automation, is that climate is going to disrupt our way of life significantly in many areas. The most dominant area of that being food scarcity. Now, we already see the sensitivity of our supply chain in respect to food and agriculture just through the pandemic. So imagine how this is with climate change, where you've got sensitivity of crops to warming temperatures and those staples failing in certain areas, and having to adapt to this along with sea level rise and flooding and extreme weather events like the bushfires and the hurricanes and so forth. This is going to put real pressure on our food supply system globally. Even more pressure than we saw during the pandemic with supply chain disruption. It's not just toilet paper you're going to have to worry about getting at Coles and Woolies, right? So how are we going to deal with this? To illustrate this problem and how this is changing, the French wine producing region, the Bordeaux region, as an example, is responsible for billions of dollars of wine production annually. But by the late 2030s, we expect somewhere between 70 to 90% of the crops in the Bordeaux to be failing because of the temperature increases in Western Europe. Now, this is a disaster for the French wine growing industry. But if you live in Kent, in the UK, guess what? You suddenly become a wine producing region because the soil conditions are very similar to those of the Bordeaux, and the temperature increases now mean that Britain can be a wine producing country. Now this is sort of the illustration of the chaos that warming temperatures are going to have on society, where we have to adapt. And food scarcity is going to create an eco-refugee drive, along with sea level rise and flooding. Now, the estimates are pretty broad here, but they range from about 300 million to 1.6 billion in terms of the potential eco-refugee load on the planet by 2050. So this is not that far away. We're talking about 28 years away. We're talking about roughly about the same time between when the internet became commercially available to today, and about that time frame we're going to have to deal with this eco-refugee situation. Now, if you're skeptical about this and you think these numbers sound unbelievable, let me just tell you that this year alone the United Nations has said we have 65 million people displaced by climate change. And a large portion of those are the 35 million or so that have been displaced in Pakistan with flooding. But remember that Bangladesh, Maldives, Tuvalu, Tonga, many of the Pacific Islands, up to 80% of their infrastructure could be gone as a result of climate change in the mid-2040s and 2050s. So how do we deal with 1 billion people now thrust upon the planet as eco-refugees? Well, the whole commercial capitalist view of socialism and how we're going to pay for this, that sort of really is no longer a viable way of thinking about this problem. We have to have new thinking. But the technology that we're developing today can solve these problems. That's the good news to be optimistic about. We just need the political and economic will. So for example, we can build self-sufficiency into our food supply, using vertical farming, lab-grown proteins and so forth. We can reduce the carbon footprint, for example, of cattle production and so forth. So there is technologies being used. These vertical farms using hydroponics and so forth are 90% more efficient in terms of water use than traditional farming methods. So this is a way for us to really think about building local supply chain sufficiency in urban centres like Auckland, Wellington and so forth, where we could have local farming. But actually, New Zealand's going to be quite resilient when it comes to climate. But the other issue we're going to have to deal with, of course, is housing these eco-refugees. Homelessness has increased in the United States by about 600% since the pandemic. This is a real problem in the United States. 30 million people in the United States today face eviction over the next 12 or 18 months as a result of inflation there. It's a really serious, significant problem, and there's just zero political will to address this. If you live in San Francisco or New York, you're seeing these homeless camps in LA. You see these homeless camps popping up all over the place now. Where I lived in New York, 23rd Street and Avenue C, where the FDR freeway comes on the southeast side of New York, there's a homeless camp with 17 families there. That is a result of the pandemic. And for each person that is left on the street, it costs the US economy about $35,000 annually. But we can 3D print a home for the cost of about $3,000 or $4,000. So there are technical solutions to that. The good news is you live in one of the most climate resilient countries in the world. And so that's why people like Peter Thiel are, buying up land and so forth here. But there is still obviously functional issues globally from an economic perspective, where economies like New Zealand are going to be asked to take some of the load, for example, from the Pacific Islands and so forth, in terms of disruption there. So we need a plan on this. So let's now get a bit more focused on the payment space, now that I've given you sort of a bit of macro view, and talk about the future of payments. Increasingly, payments is becoming a technology competency at an economy level. So this means that, if you look at payments over the next decade or two, we are shifting away from any physical form factor of payments in the way we've thought about it previously, like the use of physical cash or the use of a physical bank artifact like a checkbook or a debit card or a passbook. We're shifting away from those artifacts to a completely digital layer of payments, and the next technologies being things like smart glasses next year. This means that the ecosystem for payments is very different from the way we've thought about it in the past. We don't have just the payments processors and the payments rails operators, but we now have technology players that own the operating systems that manage the wallets, which are such a significant portion of payments moving forward. Then we have the specialist fintechs and the tech fins, players perhaps like Alipay or Tencent WeChat Pay in China, and M-Pesa in Kenya, Paytm in India, and so forth, that are specialists in the fintech space in respect to operating payments. And then you have data enablers that are paralleled. So this, you've got the open banking rule set in here, and you've got players working with those data sets, but you've also got other data that becomes important from a contextual basis of payments to make payments more effective. Now, this is where we see a divergence between the East and the West, or if you like, developed nations versus developing nations, to some extent, in respect to these payments architecture. So when smartphones came along, we knew that smartphones were going to revolutionize the way we paid. When we started talking about Apple Pay or the smartphone in the early versions of it, we were talking about how to turn your phone into a credit card or a debit card. So how we literally did this in the West is we just stuck a plastic card inside the phone. We tokenized the PAN, the 16-digit PAN, and we stuck it inside the phone, thinking, this is good because it keeps our interchange model going and it keeps the use of the POS in place for merchants. This is the most elegant solution to transition our consumers and merchants onto this new system without actually upsetting the balance of the system. But in China, they didn't do that. In China, of course, they developed QR codes. Now, China doesn't do much QR code payments anymore. They still have QR codes, and that QR codes were responsible for massive network effect in respect to the development of payments infrastructure there, because as a merchant, all you needed was a phone and to generate a QR code to be able to accept payments. So you didn't need to have a POS terminal at the time and so forth. And this really led to this massive explosion in payments. In addition, if you've studied the evolution of these payment networks in China, what was really interesting was how they got people using mobile wallets early in the piece through the use of their red packets at Chinese New Year. If you're familiar with China, China doesn't do Easter, Christmas, things like that very big. Their biggest time of the year from a holiday perspective and a gift-giving perspective is Chinese New Year. And the custom is, if you want to give someone a present, you give them a red envelope, a lychee packet. You give them that red envelope with cash in it. That's how you give gifts in China. And that's some of that's superstition about wealth and so forth there, but it's the cultural element. So Tencent WeChat Pay actually pioneered the use of these electronic red packets using their mobile wallets. This was brilliant because people started sending gifts of these money to their relatives and co-workers and friends and so forth. Now you had money in a wallet, what were you going to do with it? So you have to spend it. And so this then generated incredible demand for merchants. So this was really clever. I don't know if it was by design, but it definitely worked incredibly well. In 2013, 98% of all retail transactions were done using cash. Last year, 86% of the economy's retail transactions were done using mobile wallets. So this has created a massive shift. So last year in 2021, China did $76.8 trillion worth of mobile payments over these mobile payments networks. Alipay and Tencent WeChat Pay represent about 98% of that volume, and the rest is bank-led wallets. So if you don't get your act into gear as a payments industry producing a wallet infrastructure, then it is possible by 2030 you could all be using Chinese mobile wallets. So I'll just leave that out there. But compared with plastic card payments globally, Chinese mobile payments are almost outnumber all of the plastic card transactions globally by 2 to 1. And keep in mind, this is just China. This doesn't include Paytm in India with 500 million people on that. It doesn't include M-Pesa in Kenya, MTN Money in Nigeria and Ghana. It doesn't include PayMaya or Gcash in the Philippines, Kakao in South Korea. The list goes on and on and on. So the realization here is quite simple. The number one payment artifact in the world, if you like, the number one bank artifact in the world today is a mobile wallet. If you're still issuing a plastic card as a bank today, you're deploying 1970s technology in a 21st century world, and that's not going to work out well for you. So mobile wallets are the key. Now, of course, I can hear some of you, your brain ticking over saying, what about cybersecurity? What about all that stuff that Dave was talking about in that last session? You know, and the risks of using this technology. Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Alipay is, of course, a sister company to Alibaba, and they run the world's, China's largest shopping day called Singles Day on November 11th each year. Now, I don't know what we're going to see in a few days' time for Singles Day this year in China, but last year we saw something like $85 billion of sales in a single day, all running through the Alipay rails. Now, I don't know what your debit card transaction load limit is here, but I do know that Visa has a theoretical limit somewhere between 32 and 40,000 transactions per second. Last year, Alipay was doing 460,000 transactions per second, more than 10 times the capability of Visa's network globally, and they were doing that consistently. And they had just 0.0006 basis points of fraud, basically no fraud. How does that compare with card not present in North America? 11.2 basis points of fraud. So Chinese mobile wallets are literally 10,000 times safer than using a debit card in the United States. And I think that says a lot about the future development of payments technology. If you want payments to be safe, if you want them to be real-time, if you want them to be contextual, you're not going to be using any of the existing artifacts. You're going to be shifting to mobile wallets. Now, we can see that over the last few years, investment in the fintech space has been incredible. Yes, we're seeing a ton of layoffs in the fintech and tech arenas right now. Of course, Facebook just announced yesterday the layoff of 11,000 people. We've seen the Twitter chaos this week, but also we've seen players like MX and others in the fintech space doing a ton of layoffs. But having said that, over the period of the pandemic demonstrated just a glimpse of what life is going to be like in these highly autonomous economies where you have the use of technology in the payments arena, with 1 in 5 venture capital deals being in the fintech space, over 7.3 trillion already invested in fintech. But where it gets interesting in the wallet space in particular is with the next level of consumer technology that comes out next year, which will be the emergence of augmented reality smart glasses. This is Facebook Meta's Oculus project called Project Aria. Our Project Aria is developing smart glasses or augmented reality glasses that you'll be able to use both to play in the metaverse but also use in the real world. Their biggest competitor will be Apple. Apple, I believe, is probably ahead of them from a technology perspective, but these glasses both work by recognizing objects in the world around you using artificial intelligence as pattern recognition. You could ask your smart glasses, hey, do you know where my keys are? My car keys, and it will remember it saw them on the coffee table and direct you to them. When you go out in the real world, for example, if you're out and about and you want your morning coffee, when you walk into your normal coffee club or Starbucks or whatever it is, you know, your smart glasses will talk to the electronic barista. You'll take your online preferences into the offline world and vice versa. Smart glasses really act as this bridge between the offline and virtual worlds in a pretty elegant way. Now, of course, the mobile wallet that's built into these smart glasses will enable you to do very different contextual things around payments. For example, if you walk into a grocery store and you don't have enough money to buy your groceries today, your smart glasses hooked into your wallet ecosystem will be able to offer you additional credit to pay for your groceries. You won't have to apply for a credit card, you won't have to sign an application form. You don't need to do any of those things because we have the data to improve the context of your payment experience here. For example, we know how much you spend on groceries, we know where you go grocery shopping, and we know your balance in your wallet today isn't sufficient for your typical grocery spend, so we can serve that up. This is payments architecture and data, you know, science, data analytics combined into this sort of contextual space. So if you want to be in the credit space in the future, you're going to have to be integrated at this level from a data perspective in the wallet. When you walk into a Tesla dealership, you may have your smart glasses tell you, hey, you can't afford a Model Y, right? Maybe you should be going to the Toyota dealership down the road or something like that. This is the type of financial coaching and financial education that we can build into someone's life through a mobile wallet that you could never do with a plastic card that is essentially dumb. It doesn't even tell you your balance before and after the transaction. But smart glasses-based wallets or smartphone-based wallets are going to give you that extra context. And this is where it gets interesting because wallets become the gatekeeping mechanism for so much of our financial services activity, particularly on a retail perspective. Let's just take mortgages. So if you're looking at buying a home, you know, like a condo, apartment around, or a flat around Auckland or something like that, you know, the way we think about it today is you've got to go to the bank and jump through these hoops to get access to a mortgage. But in the future, that won't happen. In the future, when you walk into a listed real estate property, you'll see a home financing offer in your head-up display. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. This requires the mortgage broker or the credit offerer, lender, to know that you want to buy a home, because that intent to buy a home is what then enables you to trigger an offer when someone walks into a listed real estate property. Banks and mortgage providers today do not have that key point of data. Facebook has it, Google has it, Apple has it. And so unless you've got technology partnerships with the right data providers, you're not going to be in the mortgage business. If you're still waiting for someone to come and ask you for a mortgage, you're dead in this world. And before you say, yeah, but this is only retail, it doesn't work for corporate, think again. When we look at China, again with Alipay, you see them doing tens of millions of small business loans through the Alipay mobile wallet scheme. And they call this 310, Alipay calls this. 3 minutes to apply, 1 second approval, 0 humans involved in the process. Now, what's really interesting about this is we had some discussion on this yesterday about trust. How do people trust these new vehicles, these new mechanisms? Because people trust cash because it's there, it's physical, you know. But actually what we found in China is that Alipay and WeChat Pay have much higher trust scores than the traditional banks, the traditional payment mechanisms. And when we examine why, a lot of it comes down to the utility of the mobile wallet. If your mobile wallet works flawlessly at the sort of volumes they see during Singles Day and so forth and at Chinese New Year, then you're pretty safe to be using it other times of the year. And this is how trust has changed in these highly mobile wallet societies like China and in Kenya with M-Pesa, for example. The other angle, of course, is the 3D web and metaverse. This is a clip from Ready Player One. I don't know whether you've seen the movie, but this is Parzival, the main character, in a virtual store. And he goes along and he buys this X1 haptic boot suit in the virtual store. He swipes to pay. He doesn't swipe, he swipes his hand. He doesn't swipe a virtual credit card on a virtual POS. That's ridiculous. He's using a mobile wallet infrastructure, and the real world product is delivered to him. And this is how wallets are going to act as the bridge between the digital and physical worlds in the metaverse. Doesn't matter whether it's CBDC, whether it's crypto tokens, whether it's in the metaverse, in a real world store, or in an online e-commerce store, you're going to be using a mobile wallet. You're not going to be using a plastic card. So the sooner you guys move to a wallet infrastructure, the better. This is necessary because we are digitizing the entire world as part of this shift towards smart economies, the metaverse and so forth. Whether it's NFTs, tokenization of things like electricity generation, virtual property, digital twins where maybe our DNA records are stored for medical history. All of this is an effort to digitize the world, and our wallet is going to be a key artifact in sort of controlling our profile in respect to that. So what are the immediate opportunities for Payments NZ in this landscape? Well, the obvious one is what Dave was talking about, this sort of three-domain digital identity infrastructure. The fact that if you are going to build mobile wallets that can do all of these incredible things, you're going to have a very strong identity network. And many of the existing players in the payments network, such as the banks, can be trusted partners that are involved in the creation or the maintenance of digital identity. Certainly in terms of the sort of authentication of identity, as Dave was suggesting when you walk into the bar and need to prove you're of a legal age. So I do think digital identity network goes in parallel with payments networks in the future. But the other element is, with all these digital assets you're going to be owning, we need secure digital asset storage. So the ability to create, if you like, a vault of your digital assets, I think is again parallel to the way we think about wallets. Now this is important because when you understand this, you now understand that wallets must be by nature cloud-based. They're not going to be sitting in a single bank account. They're going to be a cloud-based artifact that you can access through your smartphone or your smart glasses, or you can access in the crypto world, in a smart contract world, with AI access, or for example, in the metaverse. And so this is really sort of cloud-based infrastructure that you need to develop as well, which you're probably going to need to do anyway, because we are learning that to create green, sustainable computing infrastructure with these sort of massive data demands, you need to move to cloud, because cloud is also going to represent sustainable computing platforms in the future. On-premise solutions are not going to be a part of the platform of Payments NZ within a decade or two. Now, you might say, but what about Apple Pay and Google Wallet and all of these things that are already in place? The great thing about smart glasses is it allows us to sort of create these experience chunks in terms of interaction with these mobile wallets that sort of circumvent those constraints that have already been built into the system to some extent. So I do think smart glasses offer an opportunity to create an entirely new wallet thinking in the future. But keep in mind what we talked about yesterday, that this is sort of a short-term bridge, that AIs will also have their own wallets. So when we start thinking about wholesale central bank digital currencies, we have to think about wallets that enable machines to hold assets and machines to transact. And that's something that we haven't had to do before. How do you get your smart car to sign a signature card at a branch? It sort of really doesn't work. So part of this is shifting to also non-human machine transactions through wallet infrastructure. But that's extensibility there. So I'll leave you with this one thought. With all of this chaos happening, the real question comes as to how wallets and payments and money and currency and the economy itself is going to contribute to the future of humanity. And that gives us the ability to create sustainable systems using these technologies in line with the changes we see with climate change. And that's what I hope you get out of this, that one of the core technologies to improving the future of humanity is going to be this wallet infrastructure. But it is very different from the way you think about payments today. And you've got about 10 or 15 years to completely solve this, maybe less, maybe 3 or 5 years. So you guys better get to work on it. Thank you very much.
Gee, thank you, Brett. That was extraordinary. You traversed such an amazing amount of information, and it certainly sparked the imagination and curiosity of those that were listening to that.
Fantastic.
One of the questions coming through is, how does something like smart glasses work with a privacy overlay in terms of managing preferences captured and managed by the customer?
Well, I actually think the smart glasses will give you a whole lot more control over that. First of all, what you immediately have is you have a number of biometric signals that you can use to secure the glasses. You have facial recognition, you have heuristics and behavioral tendencies, you might have gesture-based things. We can even use your heart rate as a fingerprint indicator, as well as your voice, which you'll be using for some execution on this stuff. So glasses do give you this biometric layer of security from an identity perspective that I think are much more obviously superior than a PIN number, for example.
Got you. And do you think we'll move to smart contacts for those that don't like the aesthetic of glasses?
Eventually. There's a real question about how you power them, because you can make batteries fairly small. You can make the entire frame of glasses theoretically a battery, but with contact lenses. But there are some good sci-fi movies that sort of depict the smart contact lenses and so forth. And there are people working on the applications for that. The most immediate applications in terms of the smart glasses on an industrial basis, though, tend to be things right now like for surgery, for surgeons, in the military application and things like that.
So in terms of, you said hurry up, get on with it, you need to sort the wallet out. So what do you think are the things that are currently holding us back in terms of that innovation? Is it just we need to think about things differently, or is it more than that?
One of the really challenging aspects of this is interchange. Right? Alipay and Tencent WeChat Pay don't run on interchange, and yet they're massively profitable organizations. And so shifting your thinking to those data elements, the experience elements that you can monetize. So, for example, if you're a gatekeeper on the payment gateway through a smart glasses, through a wallet, and someone wants to sell a mortgage, then they're going to have to pay for your rails to do that, right?
Yep.
And the margin you could make on a mortgage transaction, successfully executing that through smart glasses, makes interchange look like fractional stuff. But it's hard to shift off this, and I think in the US in particular, this is going to be a significant challenge, because how do MasterCard and Visa change their business model away from interchange? So I think that's one area you've got to really start to transition that. But the only way to do that is sort of have a transition plan where you move to wallet and you reduce interchange, but you're introducing other fees for merchants or operators.
Right. And it certainly is a trade country. Exporting's important to us, and some of the statistics you had on the CBDC trials in China worth $100 billion, $100 billion worth going through that already is extraordinary. So where do you see the trajectory of the one CBDC? Is it just going to continue to be exponential?
Yeah, where it gets interesting is China is going to obviously be affected by automation. Yep. So what if China decided to use the CBDC as a UBI? Yep. I know there's a lot of acronyms, but and they start using that for universal basic income, and they are able to nominate how you can use your basic income. So you can't use it on gambling in Macau or on drugs or something like that, for example.
Right.
So you could see all sorts of social implications for that, and that's not too far-fetched given what they've done with the credit scoring mechanism and things like that. So I think there's that, but obviously the bigger element will be cross-border trade. Already you are seeing Hong Kong and Singapore and the other, the surrounding nations that do a ton of work with China, starting to build gateways and bridges between the different CBDC systems. And I think this is only just going to, I think ultimately what will emerge is sort of a greater China CBDC, which is based on the E1. I think that's probably the likely outcome.
Yeah, and just we've got a couple more questions here. One's come through about the Chinese fraud numbers, how extraordinary they were in terms of the wallet compared with the card. And questions one around, is it more the ecosystems are so far reaching it's very hard for a potential fraudster to be anonymous because their penetration is so high?
Well, because if you're going to pretend to be someone else, you have to have their biometrics.
Yes.
Right. So, the password issue that Dave was talking about in the previous thing, they've really solved that. But to be fair, they've also had to give up privacy in that respect, because the facial recognition tech can be used for, stopping criminals and, for political means and so forth. So there are obvious implications with that. But I think, this is maybe where Dave and I differ on this. I think that's largely inevitable. I don't think, even with the mechanisms we're using with tokenization and improvements in the password tech, I think ultimately you have to go with biometrics and heuristics as the mechanism to secure identity on wallets and for your digital twin in particular. You don't want a password protecting your children's DNA record on the blockchain.
Yep, no, bad idea.
Yeah.
Interesting. Just in closing on your construct around the decentralisation of energy and also the decentralisation of the supply chain, that sort of thing. On the energy front, is that going to be the foundation for your carbon coin?
I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about the sort of energy system redesign and the rethinking, a great person to follow is Ramez Nam. I mentioned him briefly, I think, yesterday. But a great example of some of the changes there is like what you saw in South Australia with the deployment of the Tesla battery farm, which was sort of a really interesting experiment. And it's been so phenomenally successful that they've doubled the size of that. And now New South Wales and Victoria are both following suit there. You've got a situation where as temperatures rise or the temperature extremes change, the existing grids are starting to fail. California, Texas, New South Wales, Victoria. They're failing because we've committed to fossil fuels for so long. If we had transitioned to more renewables over time and sort of solved this battery storage problem over time, then we'd have less of an issue. But this has created sort of an acceleration of this. What's interesting is this may be Putin's greatest contribution to Western Europe in particular, solving the energy problem, in that the Ukraine conflict has really accelerated the deployment of renewables there, on the energy systems.
Yes, good point actually in terms of their exposure to that particular single energy source. So,
and that's another issue for when we talked about de-dollarization. What has also happened is that you see Russia and China are lying because Russian banks are now issuing cards on UnionPay because of the MasterCard and Visa sanctions. So you really are seeing a bifurcation sort of on the Chinese side versus the US side. And we don't sort of know where India is going to play in this yet, but if India decides to go alone as well, it weakens the US dollar as well.
Brett, as always, exceptionally informative and interesting. Just love it. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Brett, and safe travels for your next whirlwind trip around the world, isn't it?
I'm heading to Guatemala, then Zurich, then Amsterdam, then Lagos, and home for a few days before finishing the year with Istanbul, Dubai and Saudi.
Good heavens. Yeah, and I'm heading back to Wellington. Gosh, isn't that boring in comparison? I love it.
It's great to be working though after the pandemic.
It is good. So, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. We will be taking a break for lunch and back around 12:30. So the session has been recorded, so don't worry if you've missed a bit. You can come back and see that later. And thanks again for PayEd for sponsoring this session, and of course for all of our sponsors. Now, interestingly, the session straight after lunch is about the future of open banking in Aotearoa. very, very topical given the announcement this morning from the Minister regarding open banking and the CDR and the draft legislation, or sorry, the exposure draft legislation being available early next year. So that will be an interesting one to watch, listen to, and ask some questions as we try and understand more exactly what that announcement has meant this morning. So enjoy lunch and look forward to seeing you back here at 12:30. Thank you very much.